A Werewolf Shifter Romance by Lena, from Lena's Romance Library. Chapter 1. The Unwanted. The Coronation Hall buzzed with whispered cruelties, each word a knife aimed at Lyra Ashwood's heart. She pressed herself deeper into the shadowed alcove behind the marble pillar, her fingers clutching the rough stone as if it could anchor her to something solid in a world that seemed determined to reject her. Did you see her arrive? The Barren Alpha's daughter, still clinging to hope. 23 and still no wolf. It's almost pathetic. Her father should have sent her away years ago. What pack would want a leader who can't even shift? Lyra closed her eyes, letting the familiar ache settle in her chest. The grand ballroom of the Northern Territories pack house stretched before her like a glittering sea of everything she could never be. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the faces of wolves who belonged, truly belonged, to this world of ancient power and primal magic. She shouldn't have come. Her father, Alpha Marcus Ashwood, had insisted, his weathered face heavy with the burden of disappointment that never seemed to leave his eyes when he looked at her. "You're still my daughter," he'd said, straightening her silver dress with hands that had once been gentle. "You still carry our bloodline, even if she was broken, even if the moon goddess had forgotten her, even if she was the first Ashwood in 3 centuries to remain human past her 18th birthday." The music swelled as Alpha Demon Blackthorn took his place at the center of the ceremonial circle. Even from her hiding spot, Lyra could feel the raw power radiating from him like heat from a forge. 6 feet of controlled violence wrapped in an expensive black suit, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light and eyes like winter storms. He was everything an alpha should be. Dangerous, commanding, utterly untouchable, and utterly uninterested in a defective wolf daughter. "The binding ceremony will now begin," announced Elder Thorn, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Alpha Demon Blackthorn will choose his Luna from among the unmated females of age and standing." Lyra's stomach twisted. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it for months. The ancient tradition demanded that the newly crowned Alpha select a mate from the gathered pack daughters. It was supposed to be an honor, a chance for alliance and power. For her, it was just another reminder of her inadequacy. One by one, the eligible females stepped forward. Beautiful, powerful she-wolves with glossy hair and predatory grace. Each carried the scent of their wolf, that wild, intoxicating fragrance that spoke of moonlight runs and pack bonds Lyra would never understand. She turned to leave, to slip away before the inevitable conclusion, when a commotion erupted near the main entrance. Shouts, the acrid smell of blood. Then screams. Rogues. A pack of them, wild-eyed and foam-mouthed, burst through the ornate doors like a plague of nightmares. Their humanity had been stripped away by madness and isolation, leaving only feral hunger and rage. Chaos exploded through the ballroom. Tables overturned. Crystal shattered. The carefully orchestrated ceremony dissolved into primal terror as pack wolves shifted, their formal wear tearing away to reveal fur and fangs. But Lyra couldn't shift, couldn't defend herself, couldn't do anything but stumble backward as one of the rogues, a massive gray beast with yellowed fangs, locked its crazed eyes on her. It was the scent, she realized with cold terror. She smelled like prey, like helpless, breakable humanity in a room full of predators who had already chosen their sides. The rogue lunged. Lyra threw up her arms uselessly, knowing they would do nothing against supernatural strength and killing fury. This was how she would die, not in some grand sacrifice or meaningful way, but as collateral damage in a world that had never wanted her anyway. The impact never came. Instead, a sound like thunder filled her ears. When she opened her eyes, a massive black wolf stood between her and the rogue, its shoulders level with her chest. Even in wolf form, she recognized him. the midnight fur, the silver eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Alpha Demon Blackthorn. And he was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The rogue didn't stand a chance. The Alpha's attack was swift, brutal, final. One moment the gray wolf was snarling its madness, the next it lay still on the marble floor, its threat permanently ended. Around the ballroom, the other rogues were being systematically eliminated by pack warriors. But Lyra couldn't focus on any of that because the enormous black wolf had turned to face her, his silver eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, neither moved. The wolf's nostrils flared, and she saw something flicker across those inhuman features. Surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like hunger. Then he was shifting, bones and muscle flowing back into human form with fluid grace. The naked man who stood before her was even more imposing than the wolf, all lean muscle and dangerous angles, unmarked by the battle except for a thin line of blood across one cheekbone. Someone appeared with a robe, but Demon didn't take his eyes off Lyra as he shrugged into it. When he spoke, his voice was rough velvet, dark and commanding. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Up close, his scent was overwhelming. Pine forests and winter nights, with an underlying note of something wild and barely contained. It made her human senses reel in ways she didn't understand. Good. He stepped closer, and she felt the heat of his body like a physical presence. "What's your name?" "Lyra." The word came out as barely a whisper. Lyra Ashwood. Something shifted in his expression. The Barren Alpha's daughter. She could see the knowledge settle behind his eyes, waited for the familiar look of pity or dismissal. Instead, he reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with shocking gentleness. "Lyra," he repeated, as if testing the shape of her name. Then, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear despite the lingering chaos, "You're mine now." The words hit her like a physical blow. Around them, conversations stopped. The remaining pack members, those not still dealing with rogue cleanup, turned to stare in open shock. He couldn't mean it. Couldn't be choosing her, the broken daughter of a weakening pack. But his silver eyes never wavered from hers. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the absolute authority of an alpha, making a declaration that would reshape two packs' futures. "Lyra Ashwood will be my Luna." The Coronation Hall erupted into chaos once again, but this time, Lyra was at the center of it all. Chapter 2. The Claiming. The silence that followed Demon's declaration was deafening. Lyra felt as though the entire world had tilted off its axis, leaving her suspended in a moment that couldn't possibly be real. The Alpha's hand still cupped her face, his touch burning against her skin like a brand. "You can't be serious." The voice cut through the stunned quiet like a blade. Seraphina Nightshade, daughter of the Eastern Territories Beta, stepped forward with predatory grace. Her midnight hair gleamed under the chandeliers, and her amber eyes blazed with fury. "She's not even a wolf, Demon. She's nothing." Demon's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against Lyra's jaw, but he didn't turn around. His silver eyes remained locked on hers, and she saw something flicker in their depths. A warning, perhaps, or a promise. "Careful, Seraphina. You're speaking about my mate." The word hit Lyra like a physical blow. Mate. Not just Luna, but mate. The mystical, unbreakable bond that every wolf dreamed of finding. She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him he was making a mistake, that whatever he thought he sensed was wrong. She was human. Broken. She couldn't possibly be anyone's fated mate. But the words died in her throat as his thumb traced across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "This is impossible." Elder Thorn stepped forward, his ancient face creased with concern. Alpha Blackthorn, the girl shows no signs of her wolf. The moon goddess has not blessed her with... The moon goddess has blessed her with exactly what she needs. Demon's voice carried absolute authority, brooking no argument. Are you questioning my judgment, Elder? The old man's face paled. No one questioned an alpha's claim on their mate, not if they valued their position within the pack structure. But Lyra could see the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt she'd lived with her entire life. Around them, the ballroom buzzed with whispered conversations. She caught fragments. Unprecedented. Scandal. What is he thinking? Each word a reminder that she didn't belong in this world of power and ancient traditions. We need to talk. Alpha Marcus Ashwood's voice boomed across the space as her father approached, his face a mask of careful neutrality. Behind him trailed her stepmother, Elena, whose perfectly sculpted features couldn't quite hide her shock. Demon. A word in private. For the first time since he'd made his declaration, Demon's attention shifted away from Lyra. When he looked at her father, his expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. There's nothing to discuss, Marcus. I've made my choice. A choice that affects both our packs, Marcus replied evenly. Surely you understand the... complications. Demon's hand dropped from Lyra's face, leaving her skin feeling bereft of his warmth. But he didn't move away. Instead, he turned slightly, positioning himself between her and the growing crowd of onlookers like a shield made of flesh and bone. The only complication I see, Demon said, his voice carrying the lethal softness of a predator before it strikes, is anyone presuming to interfere with what belongs to me. Belongs to me. The possessive words sent an unwelcome shiver down Lyra's spine. She should be offended, should protest being claimed like property. But something deep inside her, something she'd never felt before, responded to his dominance with a heat that made her cheeks burn. Lyra. Elena's voice was artificially sweet as she stepped forward, her smile sharp as glass. Darling, perhaps you should come with me. You're clearly overwhelmed by recent events. A moment to collect yourself might be wise before making any permanent decisions. It was a lifeline, Lyra realized. A chance to escape this impossible situation before it spiraled completely out of control. She could retreat to her room, pack her few belongings, and disappear into the human world where she'd always belonged, where no one would expect her to be something she could never be. She opened her mouth to agree, to accept the escape her stepmother offered. She stays with me. Demon's voice was granite, immovable and final. His hand found hers, long fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that was gentle but unbreakable. Where she belongs. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, and Lyra gasped softly. Demon's head turned toward her at the sound, and she saw his nostrils flare slightly. For a moment, his controlled expression cracked, revealing something wild and hungry underneath. You feel it too, he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. It wasn't a question. She did feel it, this impossible pull, this sense of recognition that made no logical sense. But admitting it would mean accepting that everything she'd believed about herself, about her place in this world, might be wrong. I don't understand, she whispered back, her voice trembling. You will. His thumb traced across her knuckles, and she shivered at the contact. Trust me. Trust him. The stranger who'd just claimed her in front of two packs, who looked at her like she was something precious instead of broken. Trust the alpha whose reputation for ruthlessness was whispered about in every territory. The ceremony must be completed before the full moon, Elder Thorne said reluctantly, clearly recognizing that further protest was futile. 3 days hence. If the young woman is truly your mate, Alpha Blackthorn, The moon goddess will confirm it then. 3 days. 72 hours to understand how her entire life had changed in the span of a single evening. Lyra felt panic claw at her throat. "I need air," she managed, tugging her hand free from Demon's grip. The loss of contact was like losing a piece of herself, but she pushed the feeling down. "I need to think." She turned toward the ballroom's terrace doors, desperate for space and silence. But she'd barely taken 2 steps before Demon's voice stopped her. "Running won't change what you are, Lyra." She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm human," she said without turning around. "I'm nothing special. You'll realize your mistake soon enough." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then she heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, as he approached. When he spoke again, his voice was directly behind her, warm breath stirring the hair at the nape of her neck. "You're wrong about what you are. But even if you weren't, even if you were completely, utterly human, it wouldn't matter." His hand settled on her shoulder, warm and heavy. "You're still mine." The possessive declaration sent heat spiraling through her, followed immediately by a wave of confusion and fear. This was happening too fast. She couldn't process the implications, couldn't understand how her world had been turned upside down in the space of a single evening. "Why?" The word came out broken, barely audible. His hand tightened on her shoulder. "Because the moment I saw you, the moment your scent reached me, everything changed." Scent. Wolves were driven by scent, by the complex chemical signals that told them everything about potential mates, pack hierarchies, emotional states. But she was human. She had no wolf to call to his. Or did she? The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but present nonetheless. As if he could read her thoughts, Demon's voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her ears. "Tomorrow, we talk. Tonight." He paused and she felt rather than saw his smile. "Tonight, you try to run, and I decide whether to let you." The challenge in his words should have terrified her. Instead, it sent a thrill of anticipation racing through her blood. What was happening to her? Chapter 3. The Hunt. Lyra's feet pounded against the forest floor, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she pushed deeper into the dark embrace of the pines. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in silver fragments, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach for her with ghostly fingers. She'd made it perhaps a mile from the pack house before her human lungs began to burn, her human speed proving laughably inadequate for escape. But she had to try. Had to prove to herself, and to him, that she wasn't some helpless creature waiting to be claimed. Behind her, she could hear nothing. No pursuit. No thundering paws or breaking branches. Just the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the distant call of night birds. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe he'd been testing her. Maybe he'd let her go after all. Then the scent hit her. Pine and winter nights. Danger wrapped in silk. The same intoxicating fragrance that had surrounded her in the ballroom, but stronger now. Wilder. Her steps faltered as something primitive deep inside her responded to that smell with a longing so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. Running in a dress wasn't your best strategic choice. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees with predatory amusement. Lyra spun in a circle, searching the shadows, but saw nothing except darkness and silver moonlight. "Although I admit," the voice continued, closer now, "it does make the hunt more interesting." Hunt. The word sent a shiver of fear and something else, something darker and more complex, racing down her spine. She pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, trying to control her breathing, to think rationally despite the panic clawing at her throat. "I'm not prey," she called out to the darkness, proud that her voice barely trembled. Laughter drifted from the shadows, rich and dark as aged whiskey. No, little wolf. You're not prey. You're something far more dangerous. Little wolf. The endearment hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't a wolf, would never be a wolf. The nickname was either mockery or delusion, and she couldn't decide which was worse. Show yourself. She stepped away from the tree, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. If you're going to torment me, at least have the courage to do it face to face. The silence stretched until she began to wonder if he'd left. Then the shadows moved, and Demon Blackthorn stepped into a patch of moonlight with fluid grace. He'd changed from his formal attire into dark jeans and a black sweater that emphasized the lean power of his frame. His silver eyes seemed to glow in the darkness as they fixed on her with unnerving intensity. Torment you? He tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Is that what you think I'm doing? What else would you call it? The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Claiming me in front of everyone, calling me your mate when we both know it's impossible. Making me hope for something that can never be real. Something shifted in his expression at her last words. The predatory amusement faded, replaced by something softer and infinitely more dangerous. He took a step toward her, then another, moving with the deliberate care of someone approaching a wounded animal. What makes you think it's impossible? Because I'm human. The admission burst from her like a dam breaking. I'm broken, demon. I'm 23 years old and I've never shifted, never felt my wolf, never experienced any of the things that make someone worthy of being an alpha's mate. I'm the disappointment my father pretends doesn't exist, and the scandal my stepmother wishes would disappear. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way his eyes seemed to catch and hold the moonlight. You think being worthy is about shifting? Isn't it? She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. In a world where strength determines status, where pack bonds are everything, what use is someone who can't access the most basic part of what we are? We? His eyebrow arched, and she realized her slip. They? She corrected quickly. What they are. I'm not part of that world. Instead of responding, he reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. Tell me what you felt when that rogue attacked. The question caught her off guard. I felt terrified, helpless. Before that, his thumb brushed across her lower lip, and she had to fight not to lean into the touch. The moment before you saw the rogue, what did you feel? She frowned, trying to remember through the haze of fear and adrenaline. There had been something, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, a sense of wrongness that had made her skin crawl seconds before the attack began. I felt like something was wrong, she admitted reluctantly. Like danger was coming. Humans don't sense supernatural threats before they manifest, he said softly. They don't feel the wrongness of rogue magic or the approach of corrupted wolves. His words sent a chill through her. That doesn't mean anything. It could have been coincidence, or... What do you dream about, Lyra? The change in topic threw her. What? Your dreams. Tell me about them. She opened her mouth to deflect, to tell him it was none of his business. But something in his eyes, not demanding, not commanding, just quietly patient, made her answer honestly. I dream about running, she whispered, through forests like this one. I'm faster than I should be, stronger. I can smell things I shouldn't be able to smell, hear sounds that are too far away. And sometimes... She hesitated, heat flooding her cheeks. Sometimes I dream about silver eyes watching me, protecting me. She looked away, embarrassed by the admission. But they're just dreams. Wishful thinking from someone who doesn't fit anywhere. His fingers tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. What if they're not dreams? What if they're memories? Memories of what? Of who you really are. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Of who you were before something made you forget. The suggestion was ridiculous, impossible. But even as her rational mind rejected it, something deeper, something that had been sleeping for 23 years, stirred in recognition. That's not possible, she breathed. Isn't it? He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Magic can be bound, Lyra. Wolves can be hidden, even from themselves. Especially from themselves, if the spell is strong enough and cast early enough. You're talking about fairy tales. I'm talking about survival. His hands framed her face now, holding her gently but inescapably. Someone wanted to hide what you are. The question is why? Before she could process that statement fully, he continued. But hidden or not, suppressed or not, your wolf recognizes mine. That's why you can't stay away. Why you feel that pull between us. That's why running through these woods feels like coming home instead of fleeing into exile. He was right, she realized with dawning shock. Standing here in the forest, surrounded by the scent of pine and earth and wild things, she felt more herself than she ever had in the civilized world of pack politics and formal ceremonies. I don't understand what's happening to me, she admitted. Then let me show you. His forehead touched hers, and she felt the words more than heard them. Let me help you remember what they made you forget. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. On one side lay everything she'd ever known about herself. Broken, human, worthless. On the other lay the terrifying possibility that everything she'd believed was a lie. What if you're wrong? She whispered. What if I really am just broken? His smile was soft and fierce and utterly certain. Then we'll be broken together. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and her ability to think rationally. No one had ever offered to be broken with her before. No one had ever looked at her potential flaws and chosen to stay anyway. Demon ... Say yes, Lyra. His voice was rough with something that sounded like desperation. Say you'll let me try. The smart answer was no. The safe answer was no. But as she looked into his silver eyes and felt the wild call of the forest around them, safety seemed like a cage she'd been trapped in for far too long. Yes, she breathed. His smile was brilliant and dangerous and full of promises that made her pulse race. Then let's begin. Chapter 4. Awakening. Demon's hands were steady as he guided Lyra deeper into the forest, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Whatever he planned to show her, whatever memories he intended to unlock, it was costing him something to remain controlled. They walked in silence through moonlit paths that seemed familiar, despite her certainty she'd never been this deep in the woods before. The silver light transformed everything into something ethereal and otherworldly. Ancient oaks became cathedral pillars, and twisted roots formed natural altars where shadows danced like living things. Here, Demon said finally, stopping in a circular clearing where wildflowers grew in impossible abundance. Moonflowers, night-blooming jasmine, and silver-leafed herbs that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Do you recognize this place? Lyra turned slowly, taking in the clearing with growing confusion. There was something hauntingly familiar about it. The way the trees formed a perfect circle, the pattern of stones that created a natural seating area, the small spring that bubbled up from the earth's heart. But recognition remained just out of reach, like a word on the tip of her tongue. I dot. She pressed her fingers to her temples as a dull ache began to pulse behind her eyes. I don't know. Maybe? It feels like déjà vu. Not déjà vu, Demon said softly. Memory trying to break through whatever's been suppressing it. He knelt beside the spring and cupped water in his palms, the liquid catching moonlight like liquid silver. When he offered it to her, she hesitated. What is it? Just water. But this spring is old, older than the packs, older than recorded history. Some say it's where the first wolves learned to shift, where the moon goddess first blessed mortals with her gift. His silver eyes met hers. If there's any magic left in you, anything buried or bound, this place should call to it. The rational part of her mind, the part that had learned to protect her from disappointment, screamed warnings. This was foolish, dangerous. She was setting herself up for the cruelest kind of heartbreak, the kind that came from hoping for miracles that would never come. But a deeper part of her, something that had been sleeping for 23 years, stirred with hungry anticipation. She took the water from his hands, their fingers brushing in a contact that sent electricity racing up her arms. The liquid was shockingly cold and tasted of starlight and ancient secrets. As it slid down her throat, she felt a strange tingling begin at the base of her skull. Now, Demon said, settling cross-legged on the soft grass. Tell me about the first time you remember feeling different. Not broken, different. I dot. The tingling spread, becoming a gentle warmth that seemed to flow through her bloodstream. There was a night when I was 7. I'd gotten lost in the woods behind our territory. I was terrified, crying, certain I'd die out there alone. What happened? I heard singing. The memory surfaced with startling clarity, as if a veil had been lifted from her mind. Beautiful, haunting music that seemed to come from the trees themselves. And then I saw her. Her? A woman. She had silver hair and eyes like starlight, and she wore robes that seemed to be made of moonbeams. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. She told me I was special, that I had a gift that others would fear, so it had to be hidden until I was strong enough to bear it. Demon's entire body went rigid. What did she do? She touched my forehead, and it felt like ice and fire all at once. Then she sang, this lullaby that made me feel safe and sleepy. When I woke up, I was in my own bed, and everyone said I'd been found just outside the pack house, that I'd never really been lost at all. But you remembered differently. I remembered differently then. The warmth in her blood was growing stronger now, spreading through her chest and down to her fingertips. After that night, the dreams started. Running dreams, hunting dreams. Dreams of silver eyes and a voice calling my name. She looked at him sharply. Your voice. Demon's face had gone pale in the moonlight. Lyra, the woman you described, silver hair, starlight eyes, robes of moonbeams. That wasn't just any woman. That was the moon goddess herself. The world seemed to tilt around her. That's impossible. Is it? The moon goddess appears to those she marks as special, as chosen. Usually to deliver prophecies or issue divine commands. His hands clenched into fists on his thighs. What else did she tell you? Lyra closed her eyes, reaching for memories that had been locked away for 16 years. The warmth in her blood was making everything clearer, sharper, as if she were seeing the world through new eyes. She said, the words came slowly, dredged up from depths she hadn't known existed. She said I was born to bring balance, that light and dark, human and wolf, would meet in me and create something new, something necessary. And that I would be hunted for what I am, that enemies would try to use me or destroy me before I could fulfill my purpose. The memories were flowing faster now, cascading through her mind like a river freed from a dam. She said my power had to be bound until I found my other half, my mate. The last word hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible gap. Demon's silver eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "She bound your wolf," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been awe or terror. "The moon goddess herself bound your wolf to protect you until you were ready." "But I'm not ready," Lyra protested, even as she felt something wild and powerful stirring in her chest. "I don't know how to be what she wants me to be. I don't even know what I am." "You're mine," Demon said simply, as if that explained everything. "And I'm yours. That's all you need to know. Right now." The stirring in her chest became a roar, and suddenly Lyra couldn't breathe. Power, raw, primal, overwhelming, surged through her veins like liquid lightning. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual leaves on trees 50 yards away. Her hearing exploded until she could distinguish the heartbeats of small animals in the underbrush. And the scents. Oh, the scents. The rich, loamy smell of earth and growing things. The clean scent of running water. The musk of wild animals and night-blooming flowers. And overall, strongest of all, the intoxicating fragrance of the man watching her with fierce pride and barely controlled hunger. Her mate. "Demon," she gasped, doubling over as something fundamental shifted inside her. Not quite pain, but not pleasure either. More like every cell in her body was remembering how to be alive. "I'm here." His hands were on her shoulders, steadying her as the transformation began. "I've got you. Let it happen." "What's happening to me?" "You're remembering," he murmured against her ear. "You're becoming who you were always meant to be." The power reached a crescendo, and Lyra threw back her head and screamed, not in pain, but in recognition. In joy. In the fierce, wild celebration of a wolf finally allowed to acknowledge its nature. When the sensation faded, leaving her gasping and shaking in Demon's arms, the world had changed. Or rather, her perception of it had changed. Everything was brighter, more vivid, more alive. She could smell Demon's desire, could hear the rapid beating of his heart, could sense the carefully controlled predator that lurked beneath his civilized surface. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. She pulled back to look at him, marveling at the way moonlight turned his dark hair to silver and made his eyes glow like captured starlight. "Like I've been asleep my whole life," she whispered. "Like I'm finally awake." His smile was fierce and proud and full of dark promises. "Then let's see what you can do, little wolf." The endearment no longer felt like mockery. It felt like coming home. But even as joy flooded through her, a shadow of unease remained. The moon goddess had said she would be hunted, that enemies would try to use or destroy her. Looking at Demon's face in the moonlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hunting had already begun. Chapter 5. The Beast. Within. The first attempt at shifting was a disaster. Lyra had expected it to be like breathing, natural, instinctive, something her newly awakened wolf would know how to do. Instead, she found herself sprawled in the wildflowers, gasping and shaking as power coursed through her with no outlet, no form to take. "I can't," she panted, frustration and embarrassment burning in her cheeks. "I can feel her there, but I can't. I don't know how to let her out." Demon crouched beside her, his expression patient despite the tension she could smell radiating from him. "It's been bound for 16 years. The pathways are there, but they're rusty, like a muscle that hasn't been used. Then how do I—" "You don't think your way into it." His hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steadying. "You feel your way. Close your eyes." She obeyed, hyper-aware of his proximity, of the way his scent seemed to wrap around her like a protective embrace. "Tell me what you sense," he murmured. "You?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. "I can smell your desire, your hunger. It's intoxicating." His fingers tightened on her shoulder. "What else?" She let her newfound senses expand, reaching out into the forest around them. "There are deer about a half-mile north, a family of raccoons near the stream, something larger moving through the trees, another wolf, but not pack. A loner." "Good. Now go deeper. What do you feel inside yourself?" Lyra turned her attention inward, past the surface awareness of her body, and into something darker, more primal. There, like a caged animal pacing behind bars of moonlight and divine magic. "She's angry," Lyra whispered, surprised by the intensity of emotion she sensed. Furious at being caged for so long. And Heat flooded her cheeks. "She wants you. Desperately." Demon's breath hitched. Let her want. Let her hunger. Don't fight it. Embrace it. The suggestion sent heat spiraling through her. She'd spent her entire life learning to suppress desires, to hide her needs, to make herself smaller and less noticeable. The idea of embracing want, of letting it consume her, was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I don't know how," she admitted. "Then let me help." Before she could ask what he meant, his lips were on hers. The kiss was nothing like the chaste pecks she'd shared with human boys in her attempts to fit into the mortal world. This was claiming, consuming, a demonstration of ownership that should have offended her, but instead made her wolf howl with satisfaction. Power exploded through her at the contact, but this time it had direction, purpose. Her newly awakened senses cataloged everything. The taste of winter and wildness on his tongue, the way his heartbeat accelerated against her chest, the low growl that rumbled in his throat when she kissed him back with desperate hunger. The transformation began without conscious thought. One moment she was human, overwhelmed and burning with need. The next she was flowing, changing, bones reshaping and senses exploding into something beyond anything she'd ever imagined. When it was over, she found herself on 4 legs, her vision crystal clear in the moonlight. She was larger than she'd expected, not quite as massive as Demon's wolf, but substantial enough to command respect. Her fur was silver white with darker markings around her ears and along her spine, and when she moved, power flowed through her like liquid lightning. A sound drew her attention, part laugh, part growl of satisfaction. Demon hadn't shifted, was still kneeling in human form, watching her with eyes that burned like molten silver. "Beautiful," he breathed, reaching out to stroke her fur. "Absolutely magnificent." The contact sent sparks through her nervous system. Everything was so much more intense in this form. Touch, scent, the emotional undercurrents that flowed between them like visible threads. She tried to shift back, to return to her human form so they could talk, but nothing happened. Panic began to claw at her as she realized she was trapped, locked in a shape she didn't know how to leave. "Easy," Demon soothed, somehow reading her distress. "The first time is always difficult. Your wolf hasn't been free in 16 years. She's not ready to be caged again so soon." He stood gracefully and began removing his clothes with matter-of-fact efficiency. Lyra's wolf appreciated the display of masculine strength, the way moonlight played across the planes of his chest and the lean muscles of his abdomen. But her human mind was still present enough to be flustered by his casual nudity. "Run with me," he said simply, and then he was shifting. The transformation was flawless, powerful, a display of supernatural grace that spoke of decades of experience. His wolf was even more impressive than she remembered. Midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light, silver eyes that glowed with predatory intelligence, and a presence that radiated alpha dominance. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Her silver wolf and his midnight beast, separated by mere feet, but connected by something that transcended physical space. Then he moved, a fluid lope that carried him toward the forest edge, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to follow. They ran, through moonlit paths and shadow-dappled clearings, over fallen logs and across babbling streams. Her wolf knew these woods in ways her human mind never could have, reading scent trails and territorial markings like a map written in the language of the wild. Demon stayed beside her, matching her pace even though she could sense he was holding back his true speed. When she stumbled over unfamiliar terrain, he was there to steady her. When her confidence faltered, his presence bolstered her courage. They were perhaps 3 miles from the clearing when the scent hit them. Rogues, multiple ones, moving through their territory with purpose. Demon's wolf went rigid, his hackles rising as a growl rumbled deep in his chest. Lyra felt her own wolf respond with a mixture of fear and aggressive protectiveness that surprised her. These intruders threatened what was theirs, their territory, their pack, their bond. Through the pack link she was only beginning to understand, she felt Demon's intentions. He wanted her to return to the clearing, to safety, while he dealt with the threat. The suggestion made her wolf snarl with indignation. She was not some helpless creature to be protected. She was his mate, his equal, and she would fight beside him. The mental argument that followed was conducted entirely in growls, subtle body language, and the emotional resonance of their incomplete bond. Demon's wolf was dominant, protective, determined to shield her from danger. Her wolf was equally determined to prove her worth, to stand beside her mate as an equal partner. In the end, compromise won. They would investigate together, but she would follow his lead, would defer to his experience in matters of combat and strategy. They approached the rogue's location with careful stealth, using the wind and terrain to mask their approach. What they found made Lyra's blood run cold. 6 rogues, their fur matted and their eyes wild with madness, stood in a circle around something that made her human consciousness recoil in horror. Ritual symbols carved into the earth, still wet with what looked like blood. Candles arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the center, a photograph. Even from their hiding spot, even with the limited color vision of her wolf form, she could recognize her own face staring back from the image. They weren't random rogues causing chaos. They were here for her. Specifically for her. Demon's wolf pressed against her side, offering comfort and strength, but she could smell his fear beneath the facade of calm control. Whatever this ritual was meant to accomplish, whatever these rogues planned to do with her image and her blood, it was nothing good. The moon goddess's words echoed in her memory. You will be hunted for what you are. The hunting, it seemed, had already begun. One of the rogues lifted his muzzle and howled, not the clean, wild song of a healthy wolf, but something twisted and wrong that made her soul crawl. The others took up the call, their voices weaving together in a harmony that spoke of dark magic and darker intentions. As the last notes faded into the night, Lyra realized with crystal clarity that her awakening had been more than just the unbinding of her wolf. It had been a beacon, calling every enemy she'd ever have straight to her door. The real danger was just beginning. Chapter 6. Dark Revelations. The attack came without warning. One moment Lyra and Demon were crouched in the shadows, watching the rogues complete their twisted ritual, and the next, the night exploded into chaos. The rogues had sensed them, or perhaps the ritual had revealed their presence, because suddenly 6 pairs of mad, glowing eyes were fixed on their hiding spot. Run! Demon's mental voice cut through the pack bond with desperate urgency. Get back to the pack house. Alert the others. But before Lyra could obey, the largest of the rogues spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that sounded wrong coming from a wolf's throat. The silver wolf comes to us willingly. How convenient. The words hit her like ice water. They could speak while shifted. Something that should have been impossible unless they were far older and more powerful than typical rogues. And they knew what she was. Had been specifically looking for a silver wolf. Looking for her. Demon's massive form stepped protectively in front of her, his mental touch fierce with possessive fury. You will not touch what is mine. The lead rogue's laugh was like broken glass. Yours? Oh, Alpha Blackthorn, you understand so little about what you've claimed. The use of Demon's name sent alarm bells screaming through Lyra's mind. These weren't random rogues driven mad by isolation. They were organized, informed, and they'd come here with a specific purpose. Did you really think, the rogue continued, beginning to circle them with predatory patience, that awakening her would go unnoticed? The moment her bindings broke, every dark creature within 100 miles felt it. The silver wolf of prophecy finally revealed. Prophecy. The word made Lyra's newly awakened wolf whimper with unease. She'd thought her meeting with the moon goddess was a secret, a private moment of divine intervention. But apparently, her existence had implications she'd never imagined. What prophecy? Demon's growl carried lethal promise. The prophecy that speaks of the bridge between worlds. The one who will either unite the supernatural realm or tear it apart with her very existence. The rogue's eyes fixed on Lyra with hungry anticipation. The silver wolf who carries the blood of the Ancient Ones, who can command both light and shadow. Ancient Ones. The term triggered a memory, something her father had mentioned once in hushed tones, speaking of wolves so old and powerful they'd transcended normal pack hierarchies. Wolves who'd supposedly died out centuries ago. My bloodline goes back to the original pack founders, she managed, her mental voice shaky. Nothing more. Liar. The rogue's tone was conversational, almost amused. Your mother wasn't Marcus Ashwood's true mate, was she? She was something else entirely. Something that should have been impossible. The words hit her like physical blows. Her mother, the woman who died when Lyra was barely 3, the woman her father never spoke about except in terms of vague, painful loss. My mother was human, Lyra said, but even as the words left her, she knew they felt wrong. Had always felt wrong. Your mother, the rogue said with malicious pleasure, was the last daughter of the lunar court. The last of the moon-touched wolves who served the goddess directly. And when she mated with an alpha and bore a child, she created something that hasn't existed for 1,000 years. The forest seemed to spin around her. Lunar court. Moon-touched wolves. Terms that belonged in ancient legends, not her personal history. That's impossible, Demon snarled, but she could smell the uncertainty beneath his anger. Is it? Look at her, Alpha. Really look at her. That silver fur isn't just unusual coloring. It's starlight made manifest. Those eyes that seemed to hold moonbeams. The way she shifted on her first try after 16 years of suppression. The rogue's smile was razor sharp. She's not just a wolf, Blackthorn. She's a bridge between mortal and divine. And in the right hands, she could reshape the entire supernatural world. In your hands, you mean? Demon said flatly. Oh, we're not the ones who want her. The rogue's amusement was thick as honey. We're simply collectors. There are others with far grander plans for the last moon-touched wolf. Before either Lyra or Demon could respond, the attack began in earnest. The rogues moved with coordinated precision that spoke of military training, splitting their forces to attack from multiple angles. These weren't mad wolves driven by hunger and isolation. They were soldiers. Demon met the first attacker head-on, his massive form a blur of black fur and lethal grace. But even as he fought, Lyra could sense his divided attention, his desperate need to protect her while dealing with multiple enemies. She tried to help, to use her newfound strength and speed to assist in the battle, but her inexperience showed immediately. Where Demon moved with fluid economy, she was clumsy, uncertain. Where he anticipated attacks and countered with devastating efficiency, she barely managed to dodge. It was during one of these failed attempts to contribute that the trap was sprung. 2 rogues had been hanging back, she realized too late, waiting for her to separate herself from Demon's protection. As she stumbled over her own paws trying to avoid one attacker, the others moved in with surgical precision. The dart hit her flank before she even saw it coming. Pain exploded through her nervous system, followed immediately by a spreading numbness that made her legs buckle. Not poison, something else. Something that made her wolf whimper and retreat, leaving her human consciousness exposed and vulnerable. Lyra. Demon's roar of fury shook the forest, and she heard the wet sounds of violence as he tore through his opponents to reach her. But the paralytic agent was already working, stealing her strength and leaving her helpless. Wolfsbane and Silver Dust, the lead rogue explained conversationally as his companions began to close in. Mixed with a few other ingredients that specifically target moon-touched blood. She'll live, but she won't be shifting anytime soon. Through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, Lyra felt hands, human hands, lifting her, carrying her away from the sounds of battle. Her wolf raged against the paralysis, but it was useless. The drug had been specifically designed for creatures like her. Creatures she was only beginning to understand she was. "Don't worry, little moon daughter," one of her captors murmured as they moved through the forest with supernatural speed. "Where we're taking you, you'll learn all about your heritage, about what you're capable of, about what you're destined to become." Behind them, Demon's howls of rage and loss echoed through the trees, growing fainter with each passing moment. She tried to call out to him through their bond, to let him know she was alive, but the drug made even mental communication impossible. As consciousness finally slipped away, one thought burned through the darkness with crystal clarity. The moon goddess had said she would be hunted for what she was, but she'd never said who would be doing the hunting, or what they planned to do with her once they caught her. Now, as the forest disappeared around her and unknown enemies carried her toward an uncertain fate, Lyra realized that her awakening hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. And somewhere in the darkness behind her closed eyelids, she could swear she heard ancient voices whispering her name. Chapter 7. The ancient calling consciousness returned in fragments. The scent of old stone and burning herbs, the sound of chanting in a language that predated modern civilization, and the cold bite of silver chains around her wrists. Lyra's eyes fluttered open to find herself in what appeared to be an underground chamber carved from living rock, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows across ancient symbols etched into the walls. She was no longer in wolf form. The paralytic agent had forced her shift, leaving her human and vulnerable, dressed in a simple white robe that felt ceremonial in its plainness. The silver chains that bound her to the stone altar weren't just restraints. They were specifically designed to suppress her wolf, to keep her from accessing the power that had only recently awakened. "Ah, you're awake!" The voice came from the shadows beyond the torchlight, cultured and refined in a way that spoke of old money and older power. "Perfect timing! We were just about to begin." A figure stepped into the light. A man who appeared to be in his 40s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes like chips of ice. He wore expensive clothes that somehow managed to look both modern and timeless, and when he smiled, Lyra caught a glimpse of fangs. Not a wolf. Something else entirely. "Allow me to introduce myself," he said with old-world courtesy. "Lord Cassius Thornfield, at your service. Though I suppose in your current position, it's more accurate to say you're at mine." "What do you want?" Lyra's voice came out as a croak, her throat dry from whatever drugs they'd used to keep her unconscious. "Want?" Cassius laughed, a sound like silver bells with an undertone of malice. "My dear child, this isn't about want. This is about necessity, about preventing a catastrophe that could tear apart the carefully maintained balance between the supernatural courts." He began to pace around the altar, his movements fluid in a way that suggested inhuman grace. "You see, your awakening has created quite the stir in certain circles. The lunar court has been extinct for centuries, or so we thought. The sudden appearance of a moon-touched wolf has implications." "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came automatically, but even as she spoke it, Lyra could feel knowledge stirring in the depths of her mind. Fragments of memories that weren't quite her own, whispers of ancient power that made her blood sing with recognition. "Don't you?" Cassius stopped directly in front of her, his ice-blue eyes boring into hers. "Tell me, what do you know about the Treaty of Shadows?" The name hit her like a physical blow, triggering a cascade of images that couldn't possibly be her memories. A great hall filled with beings of power. Wolves, vampires, fae, and others she couldn't identify. A document written in blood and starlight. Oaths sworn under the light of a blood moon. "I see you do remember something," Cassius said with satisfaction. "The memories are awakening along with your power. How delightfully convenient." "Those aren't my memories," Lyra protested, even as more images flooded her mind. "I'm 23 years old. I wasn't alive during any ancient treaty." "No, but your bloodline was. And in moon-touched wolves, ancestral memory passes from mother to daughter like a genetic inheritance. Every queen of the lunar court carried the knowledge of those who came before." His smile was sharp as a blade, including the knowledge of how the Treaty of Shadows was broken. The treaty. Even thinking about it made her head pound with information she didn't want to possess. A pact between the supernatural courts to maintain the balance, to keep their wars from spilling into the human world. And somehow, it had been shattered. "The last lunar queen," Cassius continued, "broke the treaty when she chose love over duty. When she abandoned her court to mate with a common wolf, she destabilized the entire supernatural political structure. Wars erupted, territories were lost, thousands died." "My mother," Lyra whispered, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Your mother, who should have ruled the lunar court but instead chose to play house with an alpha who could never understand what she truly was." Cassius's voice carried centuries of bitter resentment. "And now you, the child of that union, carry not only her bloodline, but her responsibilities. I never asked for any of this. Destiny rarely asks permission." He gestured to the symbols carved into the chamber walls, and Lyra realized with growing horror that they were moving, shifting and rearranging themselves in patterns that made her eyes water. "Which brings us to why you're here." "To kill me?" The words came out steadier than she felt. "Kill you? My dear child, killing you would solve nothing. Dead martyrs have a tendency to inspire rebellions." Cassius reached into his jacket and withdrew an ornate silver dagger that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "No, we're going to bind you. Permanently." The ancient memories stirred again, showing her what such a binding would mean. Not just the suppression of her wolf, but the complete severing of her connection to the supernatural world. She would live, but as less than human, a hollow shell with no access to magic, no ability to shift, no connection to the pack bonds that gave meaning to a wolf's existence. The vampire court, the fae courts, the remaining wolf councils, we've all agreed. You're too dangerous to be allowed to fully manifest your heritage. One moon-touched wolf brought down an empire. We won't allow another to finish the job. Terror clawed at her throat, but beneath it, something else was stirring. Anger, not just her own anger, but the accumulated fury of generations of lunar queens who had watched their power be feared and suppressed by those too weak to wield it themselves. "You're afraid of me," she said, and was surprised to hear her voice growing stronger instead of weaker. "Terrified," Cassius admitted without shame, as any rational being should be. "Do you know what happens when a fully manifested moon-touched wolf reaches maturity?" Images flashed through her mind. Wolves made of starlight and shadow. Commands that could reshape reality. Power that made alphas kneel and vampires flee. The true heritage of the lunar court, hidden and suppressed for so long that it had become legend. The ability to command any supernatural creature, Cassius continued. To rewrite the fundamental laws that govern our kind. To destroy the careful balance that keeps our world stable. He raised the silver dagger, its blade catching torchlight like captured fire. "You could plunge us into chaos with a thought. We cannot allow that." The silver blade descended toward her heart, and Lyra felt time slow to a crawl. In that stretched moment, she became aware of something she'd been sensing but not acknowledging. A presence at the edge of her consciousness, wild and furious and coming closer with each passing second. Demon. Following their bond through whatever mystical barriers surrounded this place, driven by a rage that transcended reason. But he would be too late. The blade was inches from her skin, and even if her mate arrived, what could one alpha do against an alliance of supernatural courts? That was when the ancient voice spoke in her mind, clear as crystal and old as starlight. "You are the daughter of the moon, child. Do you really think silver chains can hold you?" Power exploded through her like a supernova, shattering the silver restraints as if they were made of glass. The ceremonial robe burst into flames that didn't burn her skin, and when she rose from the altar, it was with the bearing of royalty that had been sleeping in her blood for 23 years. Cassius stumbled backward, his aristocratic composure cracking. "Impossible! The binding should have held you until..." "Until what?" Lyra's voice carried harmonics that made the stone walls ring like bells. "Until you could cripple me? Until you could remove the threat I represent to your comfortable little power structures?" The torch flames turned silver, casting everything in lunar light. The carved symbols on the walls began to glow, responding to power they hadn't felt in centuries. "You want to know what a moon-touched wolf can do?" Lyra smiled, and it was her mother's smile, her grandmother's smile, the smile of every lunar queen who had ever ruled with starlight in her veins. "Let me show you." The first howl that echoed through the chamber wasn't hers. It was demons, and it carried the promise of violence that would shake the supernatural world to its foundations. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 8. Blood and Starlight. The chamber erupted into chaos as demons' howl reverberated through the ancient stone. Cassius's carefully orchestrated ritual dissolved into panic as his vampire guards scrambled to defend against an alpha whose rage had transcended rational thought. But it was Lyra who commanded the room. Power flowed through her like liquid starlight, awakening abilities she'd never known she possessed. The silver chains that had bound her reformed themselves at her silent command, writhing through the air like serpents to wrap around Cassius's wrists. His ice-blue eyes widened in shock as he realized the restraints weren't just holding him. They were burning him. "Moon Silver," she said, her voice carrying the authority of ancient queens. "Blessed by the goddess herself, and forged in the heart of dying stars. It doesn't just bind vampires, Lord Thornfield. It judges them." The sounds of battle grew closer as Demon fought his way through the underground complex. Through their bond, she could feel his desperation, his fury at finding her gone, his determination to tear apart anyone who had dared to touch what was his. "You don't understand what you're unleashing," Cassius gasped, his aristocratic composure cracking as the silver burned deeper. "The courts formed their alliance for good reason. Your mother's rebellion nearly destroyed." "My mother chose love over politics," Lyra interrupted, stepping down from the altar with a grace that was part predator, part goddess. She chose to follow her heart instead of bowing to fear. "And now you want to punish me for her courage?" Ancient memories flowed through her mind like a river of starlight, showing her glimpses of her mother's life. Serena Moonheart, last queen of the Lunar Court, who had possessed power beyond imagining, but had given it all up for a chance at true love with a wolf who saw her as more than just a weapon or a threat. She destabilized everything, Cassius snarled, his fangs fully extended as pain and rage overcame his careful control. The supernatural world descended into chaos when she abandoned her throne. Territories were lost, alliances shattered. "Because you couldn't conceive of a world where power wasn't hoarded by the few," Lyra said softly. "Because the thought of a court that served love instead of fear terrified you so much that you preferred war to accepting change." The chamber door exploded inward in a shower of stone and splinters. Demon burst through in his massive black wolf form, his silver eyes blazing with primal fury as he took in the scene, Lyra standing in a pool of silver light, Cassius bound and burning, vampire guards scattered and broken around the room. For a moment, their eyes met across the carnage, and Lyra felt their bond snap into perfect focus. Not just mate recognition, but something deeper. The acknowledgement of equals, of partners who would face whatever came together. Then Demon was shifting, flowing from wolf to man with liquid grace, and she was in his arms before she could draw breath. His hands framed her face, searching for injuries, for signs of harm. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough with emotion and barely controlled violence. "No," she breathed, leaning into his touch. "But Demon, there's so much I need to tell you. About what I am. About what this means. Later." His lips found hers in a kiss that tasted of desperation and relief, and promises of retribution against anyone who had dared to threaten her. "Right now, we need to leave. This place is crawling with enemies, and more are coming." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors. Not the heavy tread of wolves, but the whisper-soft movement of creatures that had learned to hunt in absolute silence. "The other courts," Cassius wheezed from his silver bonds. "They felt her awakening just as we did. You think the vampires are your only enemy? The Fae courts have been planning for this moment for centuries. The Winter Queen herself has taken an interest in the last moon-touched wolf." Ice crawled across the chamber walls at the mention of the Winter Queen, and Lyra felt ancient fear stir in her inherited memories. The Fae courts were older than vampires, more alien than wolves, and their interest in moon-touched wolves had never been benevolent. "How many?" Demon demanded, his attention split between the approaching threat and protecting her. "Does it matter?" Lyra asked quietly. "We can't keep running forever. Sooner or later, I have to face what I am and what that means." "Not like this. Not when you're still learning to control your power." Demon's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with desperate strength. "We need time. space to figure out how to handle this without starting another supernatural war. "There's already going to be a war," Cassius said with malicious satisfaction. "Her existence guarantees it. The courts will never allow a moon-touched wolf to reach full maturity. Too much depends on maintaining the current balance." "Then maybe it's time for a new balance." The words came from deep within her, carrying the weight of inherited wisdom and growing determination. Maybe it's time for the supernatural world to remember that power shared is power strengthened. The approaching footsteps were closer now, accompanied by voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Through their bond, she could feel demons' assessment of their tactical situation, surrounded, outnumbered, with no clear escape route. But they weren't helpless. Lyra closed her eyes and reached out with senses she was only beginning to understand. The underground complex sprawled around them like a maze, filled with enemies converging on their location. But beneath the ancient stone, she could feel something else. Ley lines, channels of pure magical energy that crisscrossed the earth like a vast network. Her mother's memories stirred, showing her how lunar queens had once traveled these pathways, stepping from one location to another through the flow of starlight and shadow. "I can get us out," she said, opening her eyes to meet Demon's concerned gaze. "But you have to trust me." "Always," he said without hesitation. The simple faith in his voice nearly undid her. After a lifetime of being seen as broken, as less than she should be, having someone believe in her so completely was overwhelming. "What about him?" Damon nodded toward Cassius, who was watching their exchange with calculating eyes. Lyra studied the vampire lord for a long moment, weighing options and consequences. Killing him would send a message but might also escalate the conflict beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Leaving him alive was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. "Lord Thornfield," she said formally, "you will carry a message to the courts. Tell them that the daughter of Serena Moonheart is not interested in conquest or domination. Tell them I seek balance, not war. But also tell them—" Her voice hardened, carrying the authority of ancient bloodlines. "That I will not be caged, bound, or destroyed to preserve their comfortable fears." The silver chains released him, and Cassius stumbled backward, clutching his burned wrists. They won't listen. Fear is stronger than hope in creatures who have lived as long as we have. Then they'll learn to fear what happens when moon-touched wolves are pushed too far. Lyra replied calmly. She turned back to Demon, silver light beginning to gather around them both. "Hold on to me. And whatever happens, don't let go." The ley line energy rose to meet her call, starlight and shadow wrapping around them like a living cloak. The last thing she saw before the world dissolved into silver fire was Cassius's face, painted with an expression of awe and terror. Then they were elsewhere, standing in moonlight beneath familiar trees, the pack house visible in the distance. But even as relief flooded through her, Lyra knew their escape was only a temporary reprieve. The supernatural courts had been awakened to her existence. The careful balance that had maintained peace for centuries was crumbling, and somewhere in the darkness, ancient powers were stirring to life, drawn by the scent of moon-touched blood and the promise of a war that would reshape their world forever. The real test was still to come. Chapter 9. The Price of Power. The pack house was in chaos when they arrived. Wolves streaming in and out of the Great Hall with the urgent efficiency of a military operation. Word of Lyra's abduction had spread through the Northern Territory pack like wildfire, and Alpha Marcus Ashwood's response had been swift and decisive. Every available warrior mobilized, search parties dispatched, alliances called upon. But none of that mattered now as Lyra materialized in the courtyard with Demon at her side, silver light still clinging to her skin, like starfire. "Lyra!" Her father's voice boomed across the space as he rushed toward them, his weathered face creased with relief and barely controlled rage. "Thank the goddess you're safe. When we found the battle site, the blood—" He stopped short as he took in her appearance. The way moonlight seemed to emanate from her very pores, the silver flames that danced in her eyes, the aura of power that made even seasoned wolves step back in instinctive deference. "She's not hurt," Demon said quietly, but his hand remained possessively on Lyra's lower back. "But we have bigger problems. The vampire courts know what she is. They tried to bind her permanently." "Bind her?" Elena appeared at Marcus's shoulder, her perfect features arranged in an expression of maternal concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What do you mean, bind her?" Lyra studied her stepmother with newly awakened senses, tasting the subtle currents of emotion that flowed beneath Elena's composed surface. Fear was there, yes, but also something else. Calculation, perhaps, or disappointed ambition. "They wanted to sever my connection to my wolf permanently," Lyra explained, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the assembled wolves unconsciously submit. "To turn me into something less than human, to prevent me from accessing my full heritage." "Your heritage?" Marcus's confusion was genuine, tinged with a pain so deep it made Lyra's heart ache. "Lyra, I don't understand. What heritage? Your mother was the last queen of the lunar court." The words fell into sudden silence like stones into still water. "Serena wasn't human, father. She was moon-touched, descended from the wolves who served the goddess directly. And her power lives in me." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally a grief so profound it was painful to witness. "I knew," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Deep down, I always knew there was something more to her than she told me. The way she moved, the things she could do. But she said it didn't matter. She said she'd chosen to be just a wolf, just my mate." "She did choose," Lyra said gently, stepping forward to place a comforting hand on her father's arm. "She chose love over duty, family over politics. But that doesn't mean her bloodline disappeared. It just meant it passed to me." Around them, the assembled pack members were murmuring among themselves, processing the implications of what they'd just learned. Their alpha's daughter wasn't just an unusual wolf. She was supernatural royalty, heir to power that most of them had thought was purely mythological. "This explains so much," Elder Thorn said slowly, his ancient eyes bright with newfound understanding. "The late shift, the unusual coloring, the way the forest spirits have always seemed drawn to her. We thought it was a curse, but it was actually a blessing in disguise," Demon finished, his arm tightening protectively around Lyra's waist. "But one that comes with a target painted on her back. The vampire courts aren't the only ones who see her as a threat. The Fae are mobilizing, and there are rumors of other courts taking interest." "What do they want with her?" Marcus asked, his alpha instincts warring with his parental fears. "Control," Lyra answered before Demon could respond. "They want to use my power to maintain their version of order, or they want to destroy me to prevent anyone else from using it. Either way, they see me as a tool or a threat, not as a person with the right to choose her own path." Elena stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "Perhaps we should consider negotiating. If the other courts are willing to leave the pack alone in exchange for—" "No." The word came out with such absolute authority that several wolves involuntarily stepped back. Silver light flared around Lyra, and for a moment her shadow seemed to take the shape of something far larger and more regal than a simple wolf. "I will not be traded away like a commodity. I will not be caged or bound, or sacrificed to preserve anyone's political comfort." "But the danger to the pack—" Elena began. The pack will be protected, Demon interjected, his voice carrying the iron certainty of an alpha who had made his decision. But not through appeasement. The supernatural courts need to learn that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences. Marcus looked between his daughter and the alpha who had claimed her, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward conflict. What are you proposing? An alliance, Lyra said, the words coming from some deep well of inherited wisdom. Not just between our packs, but between all the wolves who refused to bow to the old court's fear-based politics. My mother's rebellion failed because she stood alone. I won't make that mistake. You're talking about war, Elder Thorn said quietly. I'm talking about survival, Lyra corrected. The courts have made it clear that they'll never accept my existence peacefully. They'll keep coming, keep trying to bind or destroy me until someone stops them. The only question is whether we face them from a position of strength or weakness. Through their bond, she felt Demon's fierce approval of her reasoning. He'd been thinking along the same lines, she realized, preparing for a conflict that seemed inevitable given the court's reaction to her awakening. The Southern Territory has already indicated they might be willing to listen, Demon said. Alpha Reese has no love for vampire politics, and the Western packs have their own reasons to resist Fae interference. And if they refuse? Marcus asked. Then we fight alone if we have to, Lyra said simply. But we fight. The assembled wolves exchanged glances, weighing the implications of what they were being asked to consider. A war against the supernatural courts was unprecedented, dangerous beyond imagination. But the alternative, surrendering their alpha's daughter to be destroyed or enslaved, was unthinkable. There's something else, Elena said suddenly, her voice tight with an emotion Lyra couldn't identify. Something you need to know before you make any final decisions. The way she spoke sent warning bells ringing through Lyra's enhanced senses. There was guilt in Elena's scent, and fear, and something that tasted almost like shame. What are you talking about? Marcus demanded. Elena's perfect composure finally cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. The binding on Lyra's powers. It wasn't just done by the moon goddess. There was additional magic involved. Darker magic. What do you mean? Demon's voice had gone dangerously quiet. I mean, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper, that someone within the pack helped suppress her abilities. Someone who was paid very well by interested parties to ensure that the last moon-touched wolf never fully awakened. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Lyra felt her world tilt on its axis for the second time in as many days. Someone in her own pack, someone she'd trusted, lived with, called family, had betrayed her to her enemies. And from the guilty devastation on Elena's face, Lyra had a terrible suspicion she knew exactly who it was. Chapter 10. Betrayal's Bitter Truth. The silence that followed Elena's confession was deafening. Lyra felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet, leaving her suspended over an abyss of betrayal that threatened to swallow everything she'd ever believed about her family, her pack, her place in the world. Elena. Marcus's voice was barely recognizable, rough with a pain so profound it made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. What have you done? Elena's perfect composure finally shattered completely, revealing the desperate woman underneath. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold together pieces that were already breaking apart. I was protecting her, she whispered, the words coming out broken and jagged. I was protecting all of us. You don't understand what it was like, Marcus, knowing what she was, knowing what would happen when the courts found out. Start from the beginning, Demon commanded, his voice carrying the lethal softness of a predator preparing to strike. Tell us everything. Elena flinched at his tone but nodded, her hands shaking as she struggled to find words for betrayals that had festered in secret for over a decade. "It was after Serena died," she began, her voice barely audible. "I'd known about her heritage. She'd confided in me during those last weeks, when the birth complications were getting worse. She made me promise to watch over Lyra, to protect her from those who would try to use her. So you decided to cripple her instead?" The words tore from Lyra's throat with a pain that made her newly awakened wolf howl in anguish. "You thought destroying my connection to my heritage was protection? You were 3 years old." Elena's voice rose with desperate justification. Just a baby who glowed with moonlight when she slept, who made flowers bloom by touching them, who could speak to the forest spirits in languages that didn't exist. Do you have any idea how terrifying that was? How quickly word would have spread if anyone had seen? Through their bond, Lyra felt Demon's rage building like a storm front, barely contained and growing more dangerous by the moment. But beneath his fury was something else. A deep, protective love that steadied her even as her world collapsed around her. "So you sought help," Marcus said flatly, his alpha authority forcing the words from Elena even as his face grew gray with the implications. "The Thornfield family approached me first," Elena admitted, her voice gaining strength as the confession continued. "Lord Cassius himself came to our territory under a flag of truce. He said he knew what Lyra was, what she would become. He offered a solution that would keep her safe while protecting the supernatural community from disruption." "They paid you," Demon said, and it wasn't a question. Elena's silence was answer enough. "How much?" Lyra asked quietly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the hurricane of emotions tearing through her chest. "How much was my birthright worth to you?" "It wasn't about the money," Elena protested, but the guilt in her scent told a different story. "It was about keeping you alive. About giving you a chance at a normal life." "Normal?" Silver light began to gather around Lyra, responding to the intensity of her emotions. "You thought a life of feeling broken, of being treated like a failure, of never understanding why I didn't fit anywhere was normal? I thought it was better than being hunted by every supernatural court in existence." Elena's voice cracked with desperation. "I thought it was better than watching you become a weapon in political games that would tear the world apart." "That wasn't your choice to make," Marcus said, his voice heavy with a grief that went beyond simple disappointment. "She was my daughter, Elena, Serena's daughter. You had no right to decide her fate." "I had every right." Elena's composure snapped completely, revealing 20 years of buried resentment and justification. "I was the one who stayed. I was the one who picked up the pieces after your precious Serena died and left us to deal with the consequences of her choices. I was the one who raised her daughter, who loved her like my own, who sacrificed everything to keep her safe." The words hit like physical blows, each one revealing layers of hurt and bitterness that had been festering beneath Elena's perfect stepmother facade for decades. "You loved her?" Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "Is that what you call stealing 20 years of my life? Taking away my chance to know what I really was?" "I gave you 20 years of peace," Elena shot back, tears streaming down her face. 20 years of safety, of belonging somewhere. Do you think you would have been happier knowing the truth? Knowing that you were marked for death or enslavement from the moment you drew breath? "I would have been prepared," Lyra said simply. "I would have had time to learn, to grow into my power instead of having it explode out of me when enemies were already at the gate." Through the pack bond, she could feel the other wolves' shock and confusion, their struggle to process the revelation that their Luna, the woman who had guided and protected them for 2 decades, had been living a lie the entire time. The binding. Demon said, his voice cutting through the emotional chaos with surgical precision. How did they do it? Elena wiped her eyes with shaking hands. A combination of vampire magic and fey enchantment, woven together and anchored by... She hesitated, fresh guilt flooding her features. By what? Marcus demanded. By a piece of Serena's jewelry. Her moonstone pendant, the one she wore when she died. They needed something with a strong emotional connection to both mother and daughter to anchor the spell. Lyra's hand flew to her throat, where she'd worn her mother's pendant every day since she was old enough to care for it. The beautiful moonstone that caught light in impossible ways, that felt warm against her skin, that had always made her feel closer to the mother she barely remembered. They turned her memory into a cage, she breathed, understanding hitting her like a physical blow. You let them use my mother's love as a chain to bind me. Lyra, please. Elena stepped forward, her hands outstretched in desperate supplication. I know you hate me right now, but you have to understand. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was giving you the best life possible under impossible circumstances. The best life possible, Lyra repeated, her voice hollow with betrayal. 23 years of feeling like a failure. 23 years of being treated like damaged goods. 23 years of my father's disappointment and the pack's pity. She turned to face Marcus, seeing her own pain reflected in his eyes. Did you know? No. The word came out broken, weighted with a grief that went beyond simple loss. I suspected something was wrong, but Elena assured me it was normal variation, that some wolves were just late bloomers. I trusted her judgment because... He paused, his voice thick with self-recrimination. Because I wanted to believe her. Because accepting that something supernatural was suppressing your abilities would have meant accepting that I'd failed to protect you from threats I couldn't even see. The admission hung between them like a bridge over an impassable chasm. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. Her father had been as much a victim of Elena's deception as she had been, manipulated by love and trust into enabling a betrayal he never would have consciously supported. The pendant, Demon said quietly. Is it still active? Elena nodded miserably. The binding was designed to weaken over time, especially if she found her mate and their bond strengthened her connection to her wolf, but destroying it completely. She shuddered. The magical backlash could kill her. Or it could free me completely, Lyra said, her hand closing around the warm stone at her throat. Either way, it ends the lie. Lyra, no, Elena gasped. The risk is too great. You don't understand the forces involved. I understand enough. Lyra's voice carried the authority of her bloodline, the power of a queen who had finally awakened to her birthright. I understand that you've stolen 23 years of my life. I understand that you've left me vulnerable to enemies who are already hunting me. And I understand that I can't move forward while part of my power is still chained by my mother's corrupted memory. She began to lift the pendant's chain over her head, silver light gathering around her like a living thing. And I understand, she continued, her eyes meeting Elena's terrified gaze, that some betrayals can't be forgiven with explanations and tears. The moonstone pendant caught the light as she held it up, beautiful and treacherous and full of 20 years of stolen possibilities. It was time to break the last chain. Chapter 11. Breaking the Chains. The moonstone pendant hung suspended between Lyra's fingers like a fragment of captured starlight, its surface pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Around them, the assembled pack held their breath, sensing that they stood on the precipice of something that would change everything. Wait. Demon's voice cut through the tension, his hand closing gently over hers. Not like this. Not in anger. Lyra turned to face him, seeing her own turmoil reflected in his silver eyes. Demon, I can't live with this thing around my neck anymore. Knowing what it is, what it's done to me. I know. His thumb traced across her knuckles in a gesture that was both soothing and possessive. But Elena's right about one thing. The magical backlash could kill you. And I won't lose you to revenge when we've only just found each other. The bond between them hummed with his fear, his desperate need to protect her even from herself. But beneath that fear was something else. Absolute faith in her strength, her ability to survive whatever was coming. Then what do you suggest? She asked, leaning into his touch despite the chaos surrounding them. We do it properly, with preparation, safeguards, and... Demon's gaze swept the assembled pack, lingering on Marcus's grief-stricken face and Elena's terrified features. Witnesses who can help anchor you if the process becomes too dangerous. Elder Thorn stepped forward, his ancient eyes bright with understanding. The Alpha is wise. Destroying a binding of this complexity requires more than raw power. It requires ritual, intention, and the support of those who love you. Those who love me, Lyra repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth as she looked at Elena. That's a complicated list right now. Elena flinched as if struck, but didn't protest the accusation. Her perfect composure had crumbled completely, leaving behind a woman who looked older than her years, worn down by decades of carrying secrets that had poisoned everything they touched. Lyra, Marcus said quietly, approaching with the careful movements of someone trying not to spook a wounded animal. Before you do anything irreversible, let me say this. Elena's betrayal doesn't erase the fact that she did love you. Misguided, selfish, terrified love, but love nonetheless. Love? Lyra's voice cracked with pain. She stole my mother's memory and turned it into a weapon against me. She watched me suffer for 23 years and never said a word. How is that love? Because, Elena said through her tears, every single day I watched you grow up healthy and safe. I told myself the sacrifice was worth it. Every time you smiled, every time you laughed, every time you lived a normal day without running from supernatural assassins, I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. But you were wrong, Lyra said simply. Yes. Elena's admission was barely audible. I was wrong. About everything. But Lyra, please, if you're going to destroy the binding, let me help. Let me try to undo some of the damage I've caused. Demon's growl rumbled through the courtyard. You want us to trust the woman who's been lying for 20 years? I want, Elena said with quiet dignity, to face the consequences of my choices. And if that means risking my life to help break a binding I helped create, then so be it. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications none of them were quite ready to examine. Lyra studied her stepmother's face, tasting the complex mixture of guilt, fear, and desperate hope that flowed from her like a tangible thing. Why? She asked finally. Why help now, when keeping the secret would be safer for you? Elena's smile was sad and broken and achingly real. Because watching you come into your power, seeing you become who you were meant to be, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. And because I finally understand what Serena tried to tell me before she died. Which was that some gifts are too precious to cage, even when you're terrified of what they might become. Elena stepped closer, her movements careful and non-threatening. Your mother knew what you would be, knew the dangers you would face. But she also knew that trying to protect you by diminishing you would destroy the very thing that made you special. Fresh tears carved tracks down Elena's cheeks. I thought I was wiser than a woman who gave up a kingdom for love. I was wrong about that too. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, cracking something in her chest that had been frozen solid since Elena's confession. Not forgiveness. That would take time, if it ever came at all. but the first tentative recognition that people could be both deeply wrong and genuinely loving at the same time. "The ritual needs to happen at moonrise," Elder Thorn said gently, offering them a path forward through the emotional minefield. "The pendant's magic is strongest then, which means the breaking will be most effective and most dangerous." "That gives us 3 hours," Demon calculated, his tactical mind already working through the logistics. "Time to prepare protective circles, gather the materials we'll need, and decide whether we trust Elena enough to let her participate," Lyra interrupted, her eyes never leaving her stepmother's face. The question hung between them like a sword balanced on its edge. Around them, the pack waited in tense silence, sensing that the decision would shape not just Lyra's future, but the very nature of their family bonds. Elena didn't plead or make excuses. She simply stood there, tears drying on her cheeks, waiting for a judgment she knew she deserved. "I have conditions," Lyra said finally. Relief flickered across Elena's features, quickly replaced by resigned acceptance. "Name them." "Full disclosure. No more secrets, no more half-truths, no more protecting me from information I need to make my own choices. If you know something about my heritage, my mother, or the supernatural courts, you tell me. Everything. Done. And when this is over, when the binding is broken and I'm fully awakened to my power, you leave." The words came out harder than Lyra had intended, but she didn't soften them. "You find another pack, another life, because I can't heal while constantly looking at the face of my betrayer, and this pack can't move forward while carrying the weight of your lies." Elena's face crumpled with fresh grief, but she nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Lyra stepped closer, silver light beginning to gather around her like a living thing. "Do you understand that you've lost the right to call me daughter? That you've lost the right to a place in this pack, in this family? That your 20 years of deception have consequences that can't be undone with apologies and good intentions?" "Yes," Elena whispered. "I understand. And I accept it." The admission hung in the air like the final note of a funeral dirge. Around them, the pack exchanged glances, processing the reality that their Luna, the woman who had guided them for 2 decades, would soon be gone forever. "Then we have a ritual to prepare," Lyra said, turning back toward the pack house, "and a past to finally put to rest." As they moved inside to begin the preparations, Demon's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with desperate strength. Through their bond, she felt his unwavering support, his absolute faith in her ability to survive whatever was coming. But she also felt his fear, not just of the magical backlash they were about to risk, but of what she might become once all the chains were finally broken. The last moon-touched wolf, awakened to her full power, shaped by betrayal, and tempered by loss. Even Demon couldn't predict what that combination might create. In 3 hours, they would all find out. Chapter 12. The Final Awakening. The ritual circle had been carved into the earth of the sacred grove behind the pack house, its intricate symbols glowing with pale fire in the gathering dusk. Ancient protection wards ringed the clearing, their power humming through the air like a tuning fork struck against the bones of the world. Lyra stood at the circle's heart, the moonstone pendant heavy in her palm as she watched the last preparations. Elder Thorn moved with careful precision, placing crystals at specific points while murmuring incantations that made the very air shimmer. Marcus waited at the circle's edge, his face grave with the weight of what they were about to attempt. Elena knelt nearby, her hands already glowing with the silver fire of lunar magic as she prepared to help unweave the bindings she had helped create. And Demon. Demon stood just outside the protective barriers, his silver eyes never leaving her face, their bond stretched taut with shared fear and desperate hope. "The moon rises in 10 minutes. Elder Thorn announced, his ancient voice carrying across the clearing. Once we begin, there can be no stopping. The magical forces involved are too volatile to interrupt safely. Lyra nodded, rolling the pendant between her fingers. Its surface was warm to the touch, pulsing with the rhythm of a heart that had stopped beating 20 years ago. Her mother's heart, corrupted into a chain that had bound her for more than 2 decades. "Are you ready?" Elena asked softly, approaching with hesitant steps. Lyra studied her stepmother's face, seeing 20 years of guilt and regret etched in lines that hadn't been there that morning. "Are you? If this goes wrong, if the backlash kills me, you'll have to live with being responsible for my death as well as my imprisonment." Elena's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I've been living with responsibility for destroying your life for 20 years. If helping you reclaim it costs me mine, then perhaps that's justice." The raw honesty in her words was like a blade between the ribs. Not forgiveness. Lyra wasn't ready for that, might never be ready. But acknowledgement that Elena understood the full weight of what she had done. "Positions," Elder Thorn called as the first silver rays of moonlight began to filter through the canopy above. Lyra took her place at the circle's center, the pendant still clutched in her palm. Elena knelt at the eastern point, her hands already weaving patterns of light that would help unravel the binding's magical structure. Marcus stood at the northern point, his alpha power ready to anchor her if the transformation became too violent. Elder Thorn took the west, his centuries of accumulated wisdom focused on maintaining the protective barriers. And Demon remained outside the circle, his very presence a lifeline she could follow back to herself if the magic threatened to tear her apart. "Remember," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the ritual space. "The binding isn't just magical, it's emotional. It was anchored in your mother's love, your father's grief, and your own sense of loss. To break it completely, you'll have to confront not just the spell, but the feelings that gave it power." The first full ray of moonlight struck the pendant, and Lyra gasped as power exploded through her nervous system. Not painful exactly, but overwhelming. Like every cell in her body was suddenly remembering how to be alive. "Now," Elder Thorn commanded. Lyra closed her fist around the pendant and reached deep into the well of power that had been sleeping in her blood for 23 years. Silver fire erupted around her, not the gentle glow she'd experienced before, but a conflagration that turned night into day and made the very air itself seem to burn. The pendant grew hot in her palm, then hotter, until she could smell her own flesh burning. But she held on, pouring her will into the ancient crystal, demanding that it release what it had stolen. "You cannot have her," a voice whispered in her mind. Familiar, beloved, impossible. "She is not yours to cage." "Mother?" Lyra's voice came out as a sob. "I never meant for my love to become a prison," Serena's voice continued, growing stronger as the binding began to unravel. "I never meant for your heritage to be stolen in the name of safety." Around the circle, the other participants were struggling to maintain their positions as magical forces beyond imagining tore through the grove. Elena's hands bled as she worked to unweave spells she'd helped cast decades earlier. Marcus's alpha strength was the only thing keeping him upright against the psychic storm. Elder Thorn's barriers flickered dangerously as reality itself seemed to bend around the breaking binding. But it was Demon's voice that cut through the chaos, reaching her through their bond when everything else began to fade. "Come back to me, little wolf. Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're feeling, come back to me." The pendant cracked in her palm, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like a spider web of silver fire. With each crack, memories flooded through her. Not just her own memories, but her mother's. The weight of ruling the lunar court. The impossible choice between duty and love. The desperate hope that her daughter would be able to choose differently. to find a way to be both powerful and happy. She chose love, Lyra realized, understanding flooding through her like liquid starlight. She gave up everything for love, and Elena tried to protect me by taking away my ability to make the same choice. I'm sorry. Elena's voice reached her across the magical storm, thick with tears and 20 years of accumulated guilt. I'm so sorry, Lyra. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just afraid. Afraid of losing another person I loved to forces I couldn't control. The pendant shattered completely, fragments of moonstones scattering like fallen stars across the ritual circle. And with its destruction, the last chains fell away from Lyra's power. The transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. Power flooded through her, not just the strength of her wolf, but the accumulated heritage of every lunar queen who had ever ruled. She could feel the ley lines that crisscrossed the earth like a vast nervous system. Could sense every supernatural creature within 100 miles of their location. Could touch the very fabric of reality and reshape it according to her will. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she stood balanced on the knife's edge between humanity and divinity, between the woman she had been and the goddess she could become. Then Demon's voice reached her again, anchoring her to something more precious than infinite power. I love you. Not your heritage, not your magic, not what you represent to the supernatural world. I love you. Lyra, the woman who runs through forests and dreams of silver eyes. Come back to me. She opened her eyes. When had she closed them? To find herself standing in the center of a grove that had been transformed by her awakening. The trees glowed with inner light, their leaves turned to silver and starfire. Flowers bloomed out of season, their petals shimmering with the same ethereal radiance that now seemed to emanate from her very skin. And around the circle, her pack, her family, knelt in unconscious submission to power that had been hidden for far too long. I'm still me, she said wonderingly, flexing fingers that could now reshape reality with a thought. I'm still Lyra. You're magnificent, Demon breathed, and the awe in his voice made her heart race even as her newly awakened senses cataloged the fundamental changes in her nature. She was still herself, yes, but she was also something more. The bridge between worlds her mother had died trying to protect. The balance point between order and chaos that the supernatural courts feared above all else. The last moon-touched wolf finally awakened to her full heritage, and somewhere in the distance, she could feel ancient powers stirring in response to her transformation, drawn by the scent of possibility and change. The real test was only beginning. Chapter 13. The New Dawn. The supernatural courts arrived at dawn, just as Lyra had known they would. She stood on the pack house balcony, silver light still clinging to her skin like starfire, watching as figures materialized from shadow and mist across the territory borders. Vampires moved with liquid grace through the pre-dawn darkness. Fey nobility stepped through tears in reality itself, their otherworldly beauty terrible to behold. Even representatives of courts she'd only heard whispered about in her mother's inherited memories. The Shadow Walkers, the Dream Weavers, beings so old they remembered when the world was young. They came not as conquerors, but as supplicants. The awakening of a fully manifested moon-touched wolf had sent shockwaves through every supernatural power structure in existence, and they had come to witness what would emerge from the ashes of the old order. Impressive turnout, Demon said quietly, moving to stand beside her. Even after everything they'd been through, his presence still sent warmth racing through her veins, still made her newly awakened wolf purr with satisfaction. They're afraid, Lyra murmured, her enhanced senses reading the complex emotional currents flowing from the assembled courts. Not just of my power, but of what my existence means for their carefully maintained hierarchies. Below them, the pack was stirring to life, warriors taking defensive positions while trying not to appear overtly hostile. Marcus moved among them with quiet authority, his grief over Elena's betrayal tempered by fierce pride in what his daughter had become. Elena herself was nowhere to be seen. She'd left during the night as promised, disappearing into the human world to begin whatever life she could build away from the supernatural politics that had consumed her for so long. "Lord Cassius is here," Demon observed, nodding toward a familiar figure at the head of the vampire delegation. The aristocratic vampire looked considerably less composed than he had in his underground chamber, his ice-blue eyes fixed on Lyra with a mixture of awe and calculation. "So is the Winter Queen," Lyra replied, her gaze shifting to a figure of terrible beauty who stood apart from the others. The Fey Queen's presence made frost form on the windows despite the warm morning air, and even looking at her directly was like staring into the heart of an eternal blizzard. "What do they want?" Demon asked, though they both knew the answer. "To see what I'll choose to become," Lyra said simply. "Whether I'll use my power to reshape their world or destroy it entirely." The question hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. She could feel the weight of possibility pressing down on her, the knowledge that her next words and actions would determine the fate of supernatural politics for generations to come. Through their bond, she felt Demon's unwavering support, his absolute faith that whatever she chose would be right. The trust in his silver eyes made her heart ache with love so profound it threatened to overwhelm even her newfound power. "I know what I want," she said, turning to face him fully. "But first, there's something I need to ask you." His eyebrows rose in question. "When you chose me in that ballroom, when you declared me your mate in front of everyone, was it really fate? Or was it something else?" Demon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered her question. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute honesty. "I felt the mate bond the moment I saw you," he said. "But that's not why I chose you." "Then why?" His smile was soft and fierce and full of love that made her soul sing. "Because in a room full of wolves performing for my attention, you were the only one who looked like you'd rather be anywhere else. Because when danger came, your first instinct was to protect others instead of yourself. Because you've spent your entire life believing you were broken, and yet you're the strongest person I've ever met." He stepped closer, his hands framing her face with devastating gentleness. "I would have chosen you even if there was no mate bond, Lyra. I would have chosen you if you were completely human. I choose you now, knowing what you are and what you're capable of. Not because fate demands it, but because I can't imagine a world where I don't love you." The words hit her like physical blows, each one cracking something in her chest that had been frozen solid since Elena's betrayal. Not the ice of hurt, but the barriers she'd built around her heart to protect it from further damage. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission coming out broken and perfect and absolutely true. "And that's why I know what I have to do." Before he could ask what she meant, she turned back toward the assembled courts and stepped to the edge of the balcony. Power flowed around her like liquid starlight, making her voice carry across the territory with supernatural clarity. "I am Lyra Moonheart, daughter of Serena, last queen of the Lunar Court. I am the bridge between worlds, the balance point between order and chaos, the inheritor of power that your fears have kept hidden for 20 years. Silence fell across the gathering like a physical weight. Even the morning birds stopped singing, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "You came here expecting a declaration of war or submission," she continued, silver light beginning to gather around her like a living crown. "You came expecting me to either claim dominion over your courts or retreat from the supernatural world entirely." The Winter Queen stepped forward, her voice carrying the chill of eternal winter. "And what do we find instead, child of the moon?" Lyra smiled, and it was her mother's smile, her grandmother's smile, the smile of every lunar queen who had ever chosen love over fear. "You find someone who refuses to accept your false choice between tyranny and exile," she said. "I will not rule your courts, because ruling through fear and domination is what created this problem in the first place. But I will not hide what I am to preserve your comfort." "Then what do you propose?" Lord Cassius called out, his aristocratic composure carefully maintained despite the obvious uncertainty in his voice. "A new treaty," Lyra replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not one written in blood and maintained through fear, but one based on mutual respect and the recognition that strength shared is strength multiplied." She gestured toward the pack below, toward Demon beside her, toward the life she'd built despite every attempt to diminish her. "My mother chose love over duty and was punished for it. You've spent centuries maintaining a balance built on the suppression of anything that might threaten your established hierarchies. But I'm offering you something different. The chance to build a world where power serves love instead of the other way around." The assembled courts exchanged glances, processing implications that went far beyond simple political maneuvering. What she was proposing wasn't just a new treaty, it was a fundamental restructuring of supernatural society. "And if we refuse?" the Winter Queen asked, ice crystals forming in the air around her words. Lyra's smile never wavered, but the silver light around her flared brighter, and suddenly every supernatural creature present could feel the true extent of her power. Not threatening, but simply present, like standing in the shadow of a mountain and finally understanding its true size. "Then you go back to your courts and your politics and your careful balance," she said calmly. "And I stay here with my pack, with my mate, building the kind of world I want to live in. But understand this, the age of hiding is over. Moon-touched wolves walk the earth again, and we will not be caged, bound, or diminished to preserve anyone's fears." The silence stretched until it seemed to take on a weight of its own. Then, surprisingly, it was Lord Cassius who stepped forward first. "The vampire courts are interested in discussing terms," he said carefully, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her face. "Though we would require certain assurances regarding territorial boundaries and feeding rights." "The Winter Court will listen," the Fey Queen added, her voice like wind through crystal caves. "Though we reserve the right to withdraw if your proposal proves incompatible with our nature." One by one, the other courts added their voices to the chorus. Not quite agreement, but not refusal either. The tentative beginning of something that might, with time and patience and considerable effort, grow into the kind of world Lyra had envisioned. "Then let's begin," she said, stepping down from the balcony with Demon at her side. "But understand, this negotiation happens as equals. I'm not interested in being anyone's queen or goddess or political symbol. I'm interested in being free to choose my own path, and in making sure others have the same choice." As they walked toward the assembled courts, Demon's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with perfect familiarity. "No regrets," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "About which part?" she asked, glancing up at his beloved face. "Awakening to my heritage? Starting a supernatural revolution? Falling in love with an alpha who saw me when no one else could? Any of it. All of it." She considered the question as they approached the gathered representatives of powers older than human civilization, each one watching her with expressions ranging from wariness to calculation to grudging respect. 6 months ago, she'd been the pack's greatest disappointment. A wolf who couldn't shift, a daughter who couldn't fulfill her potential, a woman who'd never expected to find her place in any world, human or supernatural. Now she was something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds, a catalyst for change, a moon-touched wolf who'd chosen love over power, and somehow found a way to have both. "No regrets," she said finally, squeezing Demon's hand as they stepped forward to reshape the supernatural world. Just possibilities. The negotiations would be long and complex. The treaty they eventually crafted would be imperfect, requiring constant adjustment and compromise. There would be courts that refused to participate, enemies who preferred the old ways, challenges that would test every ounce of strength and wisdom she possessed. But for now, in this moment, with Demon's love steady in her heart and her heritage finally acknowledged, Lyra Moonheart felt something she'd never experienced before. Complete. The last moon-touched wolf had found her place in the world at last. And that world would never be the same. In the months that followed, the Moonheart Accords, as the supernatural community came to call them, would reshape the hidden world in ways no one could have predicted. Some courts thrived under the new paradigm of cooperation and mutual respect. Others retreated to distant territories, nursing old grievances and planning for a return to the previous order. But in the Northern Territory, where it all began, Lyra and Demon built something unprecedented, a pack that welcomed both wolves and other supernatural beings, a community where strength served love instead of the other way around. And on clear nights, when the moon was full and the forest sang with ancient magic, the pack would gather to hear stories of the girl who'd thought she was broken, and the alpha who'd helped her realize she was exactly who she was meant to be. Some love stories changed the people involved. This one changed the world.